This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dahlia Shenlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. We are counting on you. This episode is sponsored by the German government. Germany is now holding the EU presidency for the second half of 2020. And as our listeners know, the Tel Aviv Review is holding a special series examining Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries with a generous support.
And that includes the world's relationship, EU and America, with the Middle East in general. We're very happy today to welcome Philip Gordon. He's the Mary and David Boies Senior Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. From 2013 to 2015, under the Obama administration, he served as special assistant to the president and White House coordinator for the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf region, where he worked closely with the president, Secretary of State, and National Security Advisor on the highest Middle East priorities. Before that, he served as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton from 2009 to 2013. Before that, he had a distinguished career in international relations generally. We can't list everything. He does hold a PhD from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. We'll be discussing his seventh book, edited or authored, and this is his newest book, Losing the Long Game, The False Promise of Regime Change in the Middle East, published by St. Martin's Press in 2020. Philip Gordon is speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Your book makes a very convincing case, I think, that the policy of regime change has disastrous long-term results. There's no nice way to put it. Is there any serious remaining argument for interventionist regime change abroad, whether by the U.S., in the Middle East, or by anyone else to any other region? Or do you think this is simply fated to go the way of history, this kind of policy?
Well, yeah, you might think that looking at this track record and the devastating results where almost every time we fail to achieve our objectives and the costs are astronomical and the unintended consequences pile up, you might think that it would have gone away and never rear its head again. But the history also suggests the fact that we've been at this now for at least 70 years, if you only look at the period that I'm looking at, and time after time, notwithstanding the consequences of the previous attempt, it comes back. Whether we are now finally at a point where policymakers and pundits will take a deep breath and realize that, I'm not so sure. I mean, all you have to do is look at the current Iran debate, where there is still a healthy and vigorous advocacy for a policy of regime change.
And what is the argument? Why does America think it's good to go in and try to get rid of foreign leaders?
Well, as a general rule, it is once policymakers decide that the status quo is intolerable, then they pivot to the only way to fix that is to change the regime. Now, we don't often come to this lightly. I mean, in every case, I think we have to be fair. The regime in place was deeply problematic, right? In all of the cases I look at, Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, Egypt, Libya, Syria, I'm sure we'll come to talk about those. The status quo was pretty miserable, and you had regimes repressing their people and threatening their neighbors. The problem comes when U.S. policymakers decide we have a fix for that. We can get rid of the regime, put something better in place, and it'll be more stable, democratic, and friendly. And that's where we go wrong. It's just a sort of over-optimism. It's not to say that the problem didn't exist in the first place. It is to think somehow, again, notwithstanding this very extensive track record of failure, that we can make it better if only we put our power and our minds to it.
There have been several cases that you also tackle in your book where regime change by the United States was successful. Though they were never in the Middle East, even though they were brought up by the proponents of regime change as precedents that might serve to promote that purpose. What is it really about the Middle East that made it such a black hole where the U.S. gets bogged down in over and over again?
Yeah, I mean, You're right that there are other parts of the world and historical precedents where you can at least argue that regime change was successful. In fact, proponents of regime change in the Middle East have often referred to these other cases as the reasons why we might succeed. I mean, just think about the debate before the 2003 intervention in Iraq. Proponents of that regime change would often point to, well, look, we did it in Germany and Japan in World War II, and we've done it elsewhere in Dominican Republic and Panama and Grenada, so, why shouldn't it work in Iraq? My response to that is, let's be clear. The challenges of doing it in Iraq and other Middle Eastern countries are even more difficult than elsewhere. The Germany and Japan analogy, is worth thinking about because, yes, it's true that we changed the regimes in Germany and Japan during World War II, and the result was prosperous, stable democracies. But you also have to take into account the fact that we also went to total war for 4 years, deployed more than 2 million American troops and occupied those countries, and then poured in hundreds of billions of dollars to try to help stabilize them. So if that's your argument that it worked in Germany and Japan, you have to think twice about whether we're really prepared to go to that extent, do the similar sort of things in Iran or Iraq. On the other end of the spectrum are the arguments that, well, look, we did this in Panama in 1989 successfully, and we did it in Grenada in 1983, so we can do this. Again, the scale is just something so different. We succeeded in Panama and we got rid of Noriega, but if you scale the population, and one of the arguments behind succeeding in Panama, right, was that we flooded the zone with troops, the Powell Doctrine. To use, just for example, the same number of troops to succeed in Afghanistan as we used in Panama after regime change there, you would need over 500,000 U.S. troops for quite some time. So these precedents in other regions don't really apply. And then the last thing I'll add to that is they don't apply for the reasons I said, but also because there is something inherently more difficult in the Middle East because it is made up of artificial, for the most part, artificial states with artificial borders without the homogeneity and consensus you need to build something stable in the aftermath of getting rid of the regime.
Yet it is always the Middle East where the United States goes back to enact its attempt at regime change. It was less so in other parts of the world. Why is it so attractive, and why do they keep banging against that wall over and over again?
Though we shouldn't diminish how much the U.S. has been involved in regime change in other parts of the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've also done it elsewhere. Lately, these days, it comes up most in the Middle East because the debate has been, obviously, we did it in Iraq. There's a debate about doing so in Iran. The Obama administration tried to do so in Syria. We intervened in Libya. So most recently, it has been the conflicts of the Middle East that has pulled the United States in to try to do this. But as Dalia says, we shouldn't overlook the long history of regime change elsewhere in the world. I mentioned the relatively successful cases already, but there's also Cuba, Bay of Pigs. There's Guatemala in 1954. There's South Vietnam, U.S. support for a coup in
Chile.
1963. There's Chile in 1971.
But not so much in Africa, for example, where, human
really?
rights violations are ripe.
It depends on which theory you believe about how Patrice Lumumba was killed.
Yeah, I think that, there is some history in Africa, but Gilad is right that the stakes have been less in Africa. So even when, for the United States, there is a problematic dictator repressing his people or even threatening his neighbors, it doesn't pull the United States in the same way. It's not as compelling. In Iraq, the government can at least make the case. Weapons of mass destruction are at stake, terrorism, threats to partner countries in the region like Israel, oil supplies. Those are the factors that make it more prominent in the Middle East. And that's why there's a debate about Iran today. There are plenty of other repressive regimes in the world, but you get the United States interested when its core interests are threatened. And that's why I think that's one reason I focused the book more on the Middle East, because that's where the debate remains alive. Going back to Dalia's initial question, hasn't this forever gone away? No, it hasn't gone away because people are still advocating it primarily in the Middle East today.
Okay, I want to explore what seems to you obvious, but what the listeners need to hear about your book, which is why exactly it's so problematic. And why don't we start with, drawing on some of your cases to figure that out. And I think we have to deal with what you call the original sin, Iran. Mm-hmm. It seems like that is the model for regime change in which the intervention led to decades of basically permanent enmity, not only with the U.S., but also with Israel, fan the Middle East arms race, nuclear race. Iran is now one of the most destabilizing forces in the Middle East. Is this the paradigm? And do we expect that all the cases that follow in the Middle East will be as egregious, and in decades from now, we'll be saying they were as bad as Iran, or maybe they won't be quite as bad? Are those effects determined by the fact that that America, intervened so brutally in the 1950s to overthrow the Iranian regime?
So one of the striking things about this, and this is an important point to make in general, is that all of these cases are different in terms of the motivations for why we acted and in the way in which we acted. I do this paraphrase of Tolstoy in the book that each intervention is unsuccessful in its own way. All of the regime changes are unsuccessful, but they are unsuccessful in their own way. So if you look at the motivations in each case, sometimes we did it for Cold War geopolitical reasons, and in the case of Iran coup, it was anti-communism. Sometimes we did it over things like weapons of mass destruction, like in Iraq. Sometimes it was counterterrorism, like Afghanistan after 2001. Sometimes it was just to save lives, like Obama's intervention in Libya. So when you're looking for paradigms, even if the goal is the same, changing the regime, the motivations and the reasons are often very different. It's also worth pointing out and stressing that the way in which we go about it has been very different as well. It's not one recipe. We've already said that in the case of Iran 53, it was a CIA-backed coup. But then you have other cases where in Iraq, for example, we invade with a massive force and we occupy. In Libya, we intervene militarily, but only with air power. In Egypt, in 2011, we used diplomacy alone, and we didn't get involved militarily at all. In Afghanistan in the 80s and in Syria in the 2010s, we supported the opposition, but didn't get involved directly. So my point about that, Dalia, for your question of legacies and lessons, it is important to keep in mind that that these cases are also different in terms of how and why we go about it. What's similar in every case is the results, falling short of objectives, finding out that the costs are much greater than anyone anticipated, and in every case, unintended consequences for the United States and the people of the country.
Were there any cases of something less radical than regime change that you think could or was a bit more successful? Any sort of diplomatic pressure that would not lead to the fall of a certain regime or ruler, but which change things on the ground? I mean, it's the opposite of what you say, right? The consequences were unintended, but the justifications were different.
Yeah, it's a fair question to ask, what is the alternative to regime change? It doesn't suffice to say, well, when we try to change a regime, it's always a catastrophe, and therefore we should, blank, go home or not bother. I am not in the camp of those, and that this camp does exist, that sort of says, let's just wash our hands with it, right? Let's just wash our hands of this region. It's too complicated. Nothing we do works. We don't have any interest there, so let's just get out. I don't think that's the realistic alternative to regime change. I argue that the alternative to regime change is some combination of containment and deterrence and engagement and development and alliances that doesn't solve the problem. I think you have to admit, when you don't change the regime, there's still a problem there, but you can do a lot with tools short of regime change to protect your interests and to make people's lives better. That's unsatisfying to many because it doesn't solve the problem. And I argue in the book, this is a very American phenomenon of thinking that all problems have a solution and we can solve them because we're the most powerful country in the world, and if we just put our minds to it. I would argue that the track record raises questions about that thesis, because in all of the cases I look at, even when we put our minds to it, we didn't solve the problem. In many cases, we made it worse and ended up bearing, astronomical costs. So I think that's it's when we overstate what we can accomplish with our power that we get into trouble. But we do better when we have more realistic objectives that we pursue that are still our interests, they're still important, but stop short of transforming the region or these regimes and countries.
I mean, I want to build on that question because when I was reading, about these countries, all of these countries have very, very dire problems. They were repressive regimes, as you pointed out. I wouldn't want to live in many of them. And I'm just wondering, is there a sort of counterfactual positive model for how really long-term, egregiously oppressive regimes can fall without a U.S. military crusade?
Yeah.
And I think the example that I thought of was the Soviet Union and other communist countries, because they ultimately fell from within with lots of external pressure, but they fell from within, and the region became, we had a decade of nationalist wars, some of them unresolved, some of them flaring up right now in the Caucasus. And the only peaceful, orderly transition I know about was the Velvet Divorce. Or maybe you could argue South Africa, which is an interesting case. But maybe the problem is really more about these oppressive regimes and the devastation and their collapse, regardless of how they go. And it's a little bit of a challenge to your thesis, but I'm curious what you would answer.
No, I actually don't think it's a challenge to my thesis. As you know, I have a whole chapter of the book that argues that the Soviet case is actually relevant as an alternative to regime change. And that's important because a lot of proponents of regime change, especially in the current debate about Iran, use the Soviet Union as their model for why to pursue regime change. In this view, which I think is a caricature of history, containment of the Soviet Union was a failing policy. Ronald Reagan comes along, challenges them with the Strategic Defense Initiative, military spending, undermines the system, and topples the Soviet regime, and things get better. That's a caricature because actually the United States, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, didn't pursue regime change. That was an alternative policy that many advocated as early as the 1950s, often called rollback at the time. But our leaders then, I think, wisely realized that the cost of doing that would have been greater than the cost of containment. So we settled on a policy of containment based on the notion that these regimes would collapse eventually from within. We protected our interests, we deterred them, we used arms control and alliances. And ultimately, the Soviet Union that regime did collapse and change, but importantly, one, without a U.S. military intervention that would have caused more chaos and potentially internal strife than the way we went about it. But also importantly, it changed from above. It was the leadership that decided to pursue a different course. In other words, it precisely wasn't us fomenting different ethnic and armed groups to overthrow the country like we did in places like Afghanistan or Libya or tried to do in Syria. So I actually think the Soviet Union is a relevant model, but not in the way that regime changers argue, but actually in the opposite way. And the only thing just add one thing to that, because it's not just the Soviet Union. To the extent that there are models in the world for repressive dictatorships moving in the right direction, it is more often the case and more likely the case to come from internal evolution rather than external intervention or pressure. I'm thinking of places like Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines, all of which had military or other dictatorships, but and in none of those cases would we intervene militarily or try to sanction the country to change, but we worked with them. There was engagement, there was economic development, and then the people demanded change. So broadly, as a matter of speaking, countries are more likely to evolve in a positive direction through engagement, even if bolstered by deterrence and containment, than through forced regime change from the outside.
I actually completely agree with the analysis about why they will eventually change. My point was more about the consequences, because the consequences of how the former Soviet Union and other former communist countries look today, they lie at the heart of one of the greatest global divides right now, still. And those states many of them have become terrible states, kleptocracies and ongoing conflict. And so the question is, are the consequences truly better? And if so, for who? I mean, you could maybe your argument is that the consequences are better for America, but are the consequences necessarily better in those countries?
Well, I mean, I would argue in cases like that, the former communist regimes in the Soviet Union, that the regime change that took place post-containment was a necessary but clearly not sufficient prerequisite for them developing economically and democratically. I mean, that's regrettable. I think we had much higher hopes when this came about. I would still argue that they are better off and we are better off having evolved in the way they did then, had we gone about it in the way that we have gone about it in these Middle Eastern cases, which is to say, again, fomenting civil conflict or intervening militarily. Because in the wake of that, clearly, Russia is not what we would have liked it to be today, or even some of the other post-communist countries, but compare them to countries that have emerged from forcible regime change, like Afghanistan, where we also succeeded in the 1980s in getting rid of a communist-backed government there. We did so by arming and a jihadist opposition, which, quote unquote, successfully got rid of the communist government. But in the aftermath, you got a decade of a savage civil war in a vacuum, and ultimately the Taliban coming to power, harboring al-Qaeda, which strikes the United States, and then having to do regime change again, followed by 20 years of a hugely costly U.S. Military presence. So sure, you can't. Unfortunately, we don't have examples in the world where everything is roses after development through engagement, but it still sure looks a whole lot better than the cases where we forcibly remove the regime.
I would like to take Dalia's last question perhaps in a different direction. And that is to build on what you said, that it is America's interests that are at the heart of it at the end of the day, which is, fair and acceptable. America is a country, and a country has interests. However, when you compare it to the rhetoric of protecting human rights around the world, then it falls short. If you take some of the examples of the successful regime changes, such as in Chile, for example, where a relatively democratic regime was replaced by a brutally repressive one, that of Pinochet. And if you look at the Middle East, there are brutally repressive regimes that are loyal to, and perhaps in the American camp, that are never on the radar of regime changes, such as Saudi Arabia, for example. So my question to you, what do you make of the sincerity of these justifications when going about regime change? Part of it is, of course, in order to make regime change successful, you need to win hearts and minds. And when the sincerity of the intervening country is questioned, as it is in America's case, it's almost a foregone conclusion that it would be a failure.
Yeah, sincerity is an important word in that question, Gilad. Invariably, American leaders, because they have to justify these interventions to themselves and others, couch it in terms of promoting democracy. If there's a single lesson in all of the cases I look at, it's that as a motivation is among the weakest, because it is the least likely to come about. In other words, you can make the case that sometimes you got to do what you got to do. If you have to prevent weapons of mass destruction or terrorism, then you make the case for regime change. But to do it on the basis, which we've done many times, that the result of the intervention will be a more democratic country, there's just very little historic or even theoretical support for that notion. Obviously, we primarily tried to do that in Iraq, but we hinted at it elsewhere. Remember when Reagan sold support for the Mujahideen? They were called freedom fighters, and he tried to sell it on the notion that we were also promoting liberty and democracy. In Iraq, even more, because we have to justify it to ourselves and others. But the prospect for bringing about democracy through military intervention or support for armed opposition groups is just very, very poor. I look a little bit in the book at the sort of theoretical bases for democracy, and there's no magic recipe, but scholarly work does suggest that the prospects are greatest when there was some democracy in the country before, when you have some history of institutions that exist and will continue to exist after a regime change, when there's a degree of ethnic or cultural homogeneity in the country, or at least a shared national narrative, and when there's a degree of economic development. And the sad reality is, in none of these Middle Eastern cases do those conditions exist. And therefore, to intervene with the hope that you're going to set up a stable democracy in the aftermath, again, the prospects of that are very, very poor, as we unfortunately saw, not just in Afghanistan or Iraq, but in Libya and Egypt as well. I mentioned Iraq as the sort of classic case of this and spreading democracy, because that's of course what George W. Bush emphasized, and there's that famous Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice quote about 60 years of pursuing stability at the expense of democracy didn't make us safe. But as I point out in the book, that's true, but it's also true that the corollary, pursuing democracy at the expense of stability, doesn't necessarily make us safe either. So I think the Bush administration identified a real problem. The absence of democracy contributes to anger and resentment and even terrorism. But that didn't mean, and I think it was highly naive to believe, that by overthrowing the regime, we could then set up that democracy that would secure our interests in the country.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Iraq, because I did want to make some comments on that, the two chapters. Your book, and especially that portion of it, I think is a scathing indictment of policymaking in general. And what struck me was just how precise George H.W. Bush's senior advisors were in pinpointing what would be the terrible consequences of regime change during the first war. And then what happened? Mm-hmm. Did they all get collective amnesia? But I know this is a long question, but you then note that in the second Iraq war, when the statue of Saddam was toppled in Baghdad, Charles Krauthammer, may he rest in peace, speculated that this would send a wonderful, strong signal about advancing diplomacy with enemies like North Korea and Iran, and that could not have been more wrong. So it's like when they're right, they ignore their own advice. Mm-hmm. When they're wrong, they make up very strange predictions about things that seem really far-fetched. How is policy made? Is there any hope for policy making?
Well, hopefully, and that was one of the reasons to write the book, is that we learn from our mistakes. And if I argue anything, to our future policymakers or current ones or the American public or publics around the world, it is next time our leaders come to you and say, we know how to do this. Here's what's going to happen if we overthrow the regime. Be very skeptical, because in every case before, notwithstanding all the differences that I spell out, in every case before, it has fallen short of the promised goals. It has cost a lot more than proponents argued, and a bunch of stuff happened, the unintended consequences that were not anticipated or spelled out. So that, I would like to believe that studying the past will help us not do that in the future. And that's one reason I go in the book into so much detail about Iraq, because if there's a poster child case, it's that one. And you're right to underscore just how fantastically wrong proponents were on a number of different levels. And I go into that in some detail in the book, not to just expose people's mistakes for the sake of it. We've all been wrong about things before, but to try to warn ourselves not to fall prey to that sort of wishful thinking, almost willful wishful thinking that we saw in that case. I mean, you're right. Many of those arguing for regime change in Iraq were the very people who decided in 1991, not only decided, but articulated quite powerfully why it wouldn't have been a good idea to go to Baghdad. And then by 2003, they were suddenly telling us that we can do it, it's necessary to do, and the result will be a stable democratic Iraq that will not only be better for the Iraqi people, but will spill over and make the neighbors more democratic. And as you say, some like Krauthammer were going on to even argue that it would change the North Korea situation, because we would have so demonstrated how powerful we are and why people needed to line up behind our goals. There's obviously an Israeli element to this, because I quote then opposition leader Benjamin Netanyahu testifying to the U.S. Congress in 2002. That, remember, he used the word guarantee. I guarantee you, if we overthrow Saddam Hussein, people in Iran will take note, and it will promote democracy in Iran as well.
Let us tell you something about Netanyahu's promises and guarantees. Do you want to get into this?
That could be a whole other discussion,
exactly.
But the one that's
Ask the
relevant
voters
for this debate was precisely that. It was this notion, this will not only solve our problems in Iraq, but it'll spill over elsewhere. And when you go back and look at the debate about stability in Iraq, I cite, just for example, you have to be honest about these things. And Vice President Dick Cheney and Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz were among those leading the charge, not only that we would be welcomed as liberators, but that the Iraqis would be united once we got rid of Saddam. And there was just no historical or empirical reason to believe that.
But they predicted the exact opposite in 1991.
That's what's fascinating. That's why I write the history of 91 as well, because it's the same people. Wolfowitz even wrote a whole article after that saying we should be careful about hubris and learn the lessons of Vietnam and not over-imagine what we can accomplish with military power. I want to answer, Dalia, your one question. In the middle of that, you said, what happened? How do you explain that these same quote-unquote realist leaders, and Dick Cheney in 91 was a classic, realist. How does he go from that, don't go to Baghdad, Iraq, you'd split up Iraq into ethnic factions, we would never get out. How does that same person go from that to 10 years later saying that, we'll be greeted as liberators, Iraq can be democracy? He allowed himself to believe that. The shortest answer to that question is 9/11. That's what happened. 9/11 happened. And it made people like Cheney decide that we had to do this or we would forever be threatened. And the combination of a growth in American confidence, because that's another thing that happened in between 91 and 03 is, remember George H.W. Bush after the 91 war said we kicked the Vietnam syndrome. And we kind of did. And then you get the Clinton years of economic growth. The Soviet Union disappears, so we don't have an enemy. We're at unparalleled strength. This is behind the Krauthammer unipolar moment. You combine that self-confidence with the insecurity that comes with the 9/11 attack, and you get, we have to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and we can get rid of Saddam Hussein. The problem with that is that once we decided that, actually the administration and its supporters started to believe their own rhetoric and spin this notion that it would be easy, it would be a cakewalk, Iraqis would be democratic and stable in its aftermath. And that's a sort of line of thinking, because they had to sell their war, right? Remember Wolfowitz saying this wouldn't even cost us anything because the neighbors would do the peacekeeping and a stable Iraq would pump oil, so it wouldn't even cost anything. The lesson of all that, again, as in these other cases, is be very careful of the self-interested arguments that this is going to be easy and what it's going to produce, because it never does, and it's always more complicated than proponents argue.
No, not to dismiss the impact of your book, but do you think that the decision makers in Washington get the lessons, especially of Iraq, now instinctively because it was such a colossal failure from start to finish, and it manifests itself in the more cautious, perhaps, attitude of Obama and the more isolationist approach of Donald Trump. And, it remains to be seen what the next administration will look like in that respect. Do you see a sea change post-Iraq, Iraq being a watershed of sorts in that sense?
Yes and no, and mostly yes, but important not to completely overlook the no. And let me explain that. First of all, it is fascinating. The Iraq War obviously gave regime change a bad name. Most Americans supported the invasion of Iraq at the time. The Bush administration made a strong case. People were worried about 9/11, and most Americans supported the Iraq War. Within a few years, that clearly changed. As it led to civil war, we had to surge troops. There were, 150,000 U.S. troops fighting. It was costing us, $300 million a day, actually for the first 10 years. So, that sort of sunk in. So in that sense, yes, the Iraq War gave regime change a bad name, and ironically, helps bring Barack Obama to power. Right? I mean, one of the reasons he won the primaries against Hillary Clinton in 2008 is that he had opposed the war famously and she had supported it. And then he beats John McCain in the general election because, among other factors, McCain had the support for the Iraq War on his back. So clearly, I mean, if you had asked that question in 2009 when Obama takes office, the answer would be obviously yes. We're never doing this again. Regime change got a bad name. We've now elected a president who's instinctively opposed to military intervention in the Middle East, wants to pivot to other regions like Asia, and this is a historical relic. I say ironic because within 2 years, and I wanted to write about this. I was myself deeply involved in these episodes in the Obama administration. Obama himself finds himself pursuing regime changes in Egypt, in Libya, and in Syria, driven by the Arab Spring and developments on the ground. But nonetheless, I think American policymakers allowed themselves once again to believe, well, maybe it's different now, and maybe we can successfully get rid of bad regime and put better ones in place. So in that sense, and again, this goes back to Dahlia's very initial question, hasn't this gone away? Isn't it buried? Well, it sure seemed buried by 2009, but by 2011, we were actively pursuing regime changes in Middle Eastern countries again. So where are we now? You're right that we then get Trump after Obama, who clearly is not, to the extent he has clear views on anything, a proponent of regime change. In fact, he argues often that we waste way too much money, blood, and treasure in the Middle East.
Anyway, he thinks that Sisi is a wonderful guy. So,
and he is absolutely comfortable with his favorite dictator, al-Sisi, and others. So in that sense, especially because Trump was elected, the pendulum didn't swing back after Obama to more enthusiastic proponents of Middle East military intervention, but actually, went wildly in the other direction of America first, don't bother with that. And yet we're sitting here in 2020, and there is an active debate about regime change in Iran, with articles in the Washington Post and Foreign Affairs and elsewhere, and a president who, for all his own instinctive opposition to military intervention, surrounded himself with explicit, well-known proponents of regime change in Iran. His national security advisor for a time was John Bolton. His attorney, Rudy Giuliani, has been, speaking at all sorts of conferences advocating regime change in Iran. And frankly, if you actually look at the Trump administration's policy on Iran, you can only conclude that the real goal is regime change. I mean, the ostensible policy is just regime behavior. But in unguarded moments, people like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo admit that Iran's never going to agree to the deal that the Trump administration is proposing. And the real objective is to collapse the regime through economic pressure. So, in a sense, yes, the American people are fed up with this. They've learned a lot of the lessons I write about, apparently, and have no appetite for regime change in the Middle East. But on the other hand, we've just had an administration for 4 years that pretty much has a policy of regime change in Iran.
Okay, but I do want to try to distinguish one thing that I found, one of the only things I found maybe a little bit raising questions for me about your approach, and that's the conflation of these very carefully calculated and plotted approaches to military interference for regime change versus what happened under the Obama years, which was a kind of getting dragged into it, and in the case of Egypt, not even with a military component. If anything, pressure was wielded by withholding military sales. Is there any distinction to be made in terms of the consequences? Or would you say in terms of consequences, there's no difference? The intervention is bad no matter whether it's military, non-military, planned or unplanned.
Look, there are obviously differences. And, Obama calling for Mubarak to step down in Egypt is not the same thing as invading Iraq with 100,000 U.S. troops. Okay, so let's be clear about that. And I'm at pains constantly to point out the differences in motivation and in method. And yet, it is still striking and important to notice that the process itself of using U.S. policy to get rid of a foreign government and political system creates many similar consequences, even when the motivations and means are very different. Because what it does in all of these cases, almost by definition, is it removes whatever institutions and political structures exist, and it creates, in every case, no matter what the method or motivation, security and political vacuum. And when that's done, particularly in states that are artificial and deeply divided, with neighbors having such conflicting interests, you then get a free-for-all when the country is up for grabs. And so in that sense, it's similar, and it sort of doesn't really matter how you go about it. If what you're doing is removing any semblance of order, no matter how bad that order is, you create similar dynamics, including competition among groups within the country for power, which tend to be won by the most extreme or violent, competition among neighboring states to fill the vacuum, which we see in Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. And the patterns in the aftermath of these regime changes of all types are almost always that initially it seems like a success. And that's why I call it losing the long game, because in the short term, in all of these cases, there's like a mission accomplished moment where it feels like we had a great success. And then you start to see these consequences. So that's why, even though they're very different, and believe me, as part of the Obama administration, I would distinguish between what we did and some of the past cases. Nonetheless, in all of the cases, the outcomes of overstating likely achievement of goals, understating costs and consequences and unintended consequences are quite strikingly similar.
Right. Okay. Well, we have to finish up soon, but I want to ask one last question, which does bring in the question of multilateralism. This particular episode is part of our series sponsored by the German government, and I'm curious if you can try to give an assessment of whether the multilateral cases where there was an international coalition somehow turn out differently than the cases where the U.S. went this alone. And how do you see the future of American cooperation with Europe or in general, other countries in terms of what should happen in the Middle East?
So in most of these cases, I already described how American political culture, strategic culture led Americans to be the proponents of doing this, and this can-do attitude and optimism, which is broadly not shared by our European partners. They, I think, are more realistic about what they can accomplish, and they obviously don't even have the power to contemplate the types of interventions like we did in Iraq, and that's why there was such a big transatlantic split over the Iraq intervention. But not in every case, because in some cases, the Europeans were actually more enthusiastic proponents of intervention than the Americans. And I'm thinking primarily, obviously the Iran intervention was very British in 1953, but more recently, primarily Libya, which I lived through in great detail, both when I was at the State Department doing Europe, because it was a NATO intervention, and then at the White House dealing with the aftermath. There, and I write about this also in some detail in the book, the Europeans pressed a hesitant Obama administration to intervene in Libya. I traveled to Paris with Secretary of State Clinton and listened to foreign minister after foreign minister of our G7 counterparts in Europe press the United States to act. And it was one of the main reasons why we did. I think she was divided. Obama was reluctant. But when we felt all of this pressure from our European allies, the United States decided to go along. And at least in that case, notwithstanding allied support and doing it as a coalition and giving NATO the lead, it still didn't succeed. So I guess, in that sense, to your question, I would say no. Alliance support and multilateralism helps, and in most cases puts us in a stronger position. I would argue the Iran nuclear deal was a case of doing this together and having a chance at better results, but it's certainly not a sufficient condition. And Libya, if you will, is one where, in a sense, we did everything right in terms of alliances. We got a Security Council mandate. We cooperated closely with our allies. We even put them in the lead. But that wasn't enough to overcome the reality that covers all of these episodes, which is that when you overthrow a regime and create a security vacuum, all the alliance support in the world. In Afghanistan, we also had great NATO support to try to deal with the aftermath, but even that is not sufficient to do so.
Well, on that cautionary note, we've been speaking with Philip Gordon, talking about his book, Losing the Long Game, The False Promise of Regime Change in the Middle East. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed the discussion.
And thanks to Itai Shelem, our sound engineer and producer, and again to the German government for sponsoring this special series on Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries and their relationship with the Middle East. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. We even take critical ones. Just go to the ratings and review section and write one. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have over 600 interviews. And if you like us, you can like us on Facebook. We're called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.